Welcome back to the table, friends. I am your humble host, GreyDMS, and with me, as always, is Owen.
Hi there.
Today, we come to the table to discuss something that Owen is going to guide us through, something dangerous and alluring for many of us.
Oh,
the world of LARPing.
Okay, I guess that's my topic.
Set the mood.
Yeah, set the mood. Let me change everything. So yeah, I've got a wall of text here that I'm going to read to you, Gray, and we're going to see how much
I'm
you
here
enjoy
for
it. If you're here for it, all right. I'll try to read good. So, in an ancient amphitheater, thousands of spectators roar as costume combatants clash. It's not a modern live-action role-playing event. It's the Roman Coliseum almost 2 millennia ago. Romans were known to stage elaborate mock battles on land and even naval engagements by flooding the arenas. These bloody spectacles weren't games as we think of them. Real lives were often lost for entertainment. Yet they illustrate a truth. Humans have long been drawn to enacting conflict for spectacle or ritual. From tribal war dances to medieval tournaments, the instinct to role-play scenarios in a live, physical way runs deep in our history. In the Middle Ages, knights in armor would joust and perform melee battles, sometimes reenacting famous combats from antiquity. These tournaments were half sport, half theater, a chance to relive the narrative. So fast forward to the 17th century. In 1638, members of London's Honourable Artillery Company put on mock battle between Christians and Saracens, drilling with muskets for the audience. Such martial pageantry served both as training and public diversion. By the 19th century, historical reenactments became popular commemorations. The Romantic Victorian era saw nobles like the Earl of Eglinton hosting a lavish medieval jousting tournament in 1839, complete with knights in armor and 100,000 eager spectators. Across the Atlantic, American Civil War veterans reenacted battles to honor fallen comrades. Notably, the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg in 1913 drew over 50,000 aging Union and Confederate veterans for a staged picket's charge. While these veterans marched gingerly rather than actually fighting, they laid a wreath on history by playing War One More Time for remembrance.
What the fuck?
What?
Well, I knew guys who basically reenact. I understood all that. I didn't know the people that were there did it.
Yeah.
That's some twisted shit,
isn't it?
Remember when Johnny died? Died right here. I'm gonna celebrate his life by pretending to stab another Yankee.
Well, another thing is like, hey, remember when I shot at you?
Yeah, it's kind of, jeez. Yeah, that's right. Let both sides. They agreed to this.
Yeah. Crazy. So yeah, importantly, none of these people would have found reenacting these spectacles strange. They were reenactors, ritual combatants, or showmen. But seen with modern eyes, these early practices, Roman mock battles, medieval tourneys, historical pageants, were precursors to live-action roleplay. They provided a context where participants and audiences willingly suspended belief to indulge in a bit of make-believe made real. The bridge from reenactment to LARP isn't direct, but it's built on a common human impulse to step into a role and bring stories or conflict to life. So you might ask, when do we get people actually playing characters for fun, not just reenacting history? We're going to move on to the 20th century when that very shift began. Before we introduce modern role players in capes and foam swords, we have to meet some imaginative folks who turned war and diplomacy into particularly playing... Wow, words are hard. Before we introduce modern role players in capes and foam swords, we have to meet some imaginative folks who turned war and diplomacy into participatory play acting, planting the seeds of LARP. So our journey into modern LARP begins with an unlikely pair: military simulations and literary imagination. In the early 1900s, author G.K. Chesterton wrote a whimsical story about a club that would stage adventures for paying clients, essentially a fictional blueprint for commercial LARPs. Meanwhile, beyond fiction, real-world roleplay crept in through education and politics. In the 1920s, students in model League of Nations clubs impersonated diplomats to practice international negotiations. Even an assassin-style game where players stalk and eliminate each other with mock weapons may have been played in New York City as early as 1920. And in psychiatric circles of the era, Jacob Moreno's psychodrama let patients act out scenarios for therapy, showing the power of roleplay to probe reality. Yet, the idea of doing this for pure fun had not fully crystallized. That changed by mid-century. In the 1960s, ushered in both counterculture and birth of organized imaginative play. In 1966, a group of friends in Berkeley, California had a medieval-themed costume party tournament that was half scholarly joke, half serious fun. The gathering became the Society for Creative Anachronism, or the SCA. We talked about this in the GURPS podcast.
Mm-hmm.
A group of devoted people recreating pre-17th century life, reliving history, as they put it. The SCA's early events mixed historical fencing, armored combat, and courtly ceremonies. Participants each adopted a persona, perhaps a Norman knight or a Persian lady, and tried to act in period style. While SCA members insisted they were doing real history, not a game, they undeniably role-played characters in a continuous improvised theater of medieval life. By 1969, similar clubs like Markland Medieval Mercenary Militia at the University of Maryland popped up. Thousands would eventually join these societies, holding grand mock battles with rattan swords. In many ways, the SCA was live-action roleplay before the term existed, just minus the epic fantasy and rules that define LARP today. Around the same time, another breed of game was emerging, tabletop wargaming, and its offshoot, role-playing games. Military officers had long used map-based wargames to simulate battles, but hobbyists turned them into play. By the 1960s, enthusiasts were pushing games to be more immersive. A pivotal moment came in 1967 in Minnesota when a young wargamer named Dave Weasley ran an experiment called Brunstein, which we talked about in one of your podcasts. Instead of players commanding armies as usual, Weasley assigned each player an individual role, like a town mayor or a university chancellor in a Napoleonic-era town scenario. The players improvised actions for their characters, and the battle became a free-form story. Bronstein was chaotic, creative, and only semi-structured, but it planted a seed. One participant in those sessions, Dave Arneson, took the idea and in 1971 added fantasy elements like dragons and dungeons, essentially inventing the first fantasy role-playing game. By 1974, Arneson and Gary Gygax released Dungeons & Dragons as a tabletop RPG, unleashing the concept of players pretending to be fictional characters on a quest guided by a referee. Why does this matter for LARP? Because the moment people had a framework to be an elf, a wizard, or a vampire in a game, it's only a matter of time before someone said, let's put on costumes and do this live.
That leap is surprisingly slippery.
Yeah.
I mean, even in our own experience, we're just like, oh, hey, man, this vampire game is awesome. We're all sitting around on a couch, throwing dice and relaxing. And then someone's just like, we should all dress up and have dinner together. Like, what? I mean,
in character.
Okay. Sure.
So yeah, in fact, even before D&D, bits of live action roleplay were sneaking in. In the late 1960s, college students were seen crawling through steam tunnels playing live adventures. There's a famous case at Michigan State University where a student disappeared for about a month from his dormitory room on August 15th, 1979. And on the campus of MIT in the 1970s, students devised assassin games with foam dart guns and water pistols, stalking each other in dorm halls, a tradition that spread to many colleges and even inspired movies. So particular movies that were inspired by this: Tag, the assassination game in 1982, and Gotcha from 1985. Yeah, so I did a little bit of look on this, and apparently there is a MIT charter for the game Assassin and rules that they follow, and there are groups, and it's not just MIT, like several colleges have these.
Like I became aware of that in the, like, as I was growing up, like I remember hearing about that and I was just like, what is that? That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I never got closer to it.
So by the late 70s, multiple threads, historical reenactment, improvisational theater, and RPGs were converging. People in different places, unaware of each other, started inventing live-action roleplay. There was no single inventor of LARP. It sprang up almost simultaneously in North America, Europe, and Australia among fans who loved fantasy and sci-fi and wanted to physically experience such settings. Childhood games of make-believe were about to get a very grown-up upgrade. So, late 1970s, really fertile time for geek culture, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. Pretty much these IPs just totally took the world by storm, and people wanted to play them. And, it just really just started to grow from that point. So, crisp autumn day, 1977, in a wooded park near Washington, D.C., a college freshman named Brian Weiss has invited anyone who will listen to join a Hobbit war. Inspired by the epic battles of Tolkien and swashbuckling Robin Hood films, Weiss and a handful of friends sneak into the woods with foam-padded weapons and homemade medieval garb. They divide into teams, build makeshift forts out of fallen branches, and at the sound of a horn, charge into an ecstatic clash of swords and shields. There are no spectators, just players living a battle from their favorite fantasy story. This was the birth of Dagohir.
Dagohir?
Yeah, Dagohir. Yes.
Oh, fair enough.
That is phonetically how it's supposed to be said. It's Dagorhir.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. It's one of the earliest recorded LARP groups in the United States, founded in 1977. Weiss's little guerrilla war game, initially dubbed Hobbit Wars, soon grew into regular events with increasingly elaborate rules and full contact foam combat. He found that requiring medieval costumes made players take the role play more seriously. Those who showed up in jeans quickly switched to tunics once they saw how immersive it felt. Dagohir combined improvised acting and athletic sword swinging. In essence, Weiss and friends turned Tolkien-esque daydreams into a weekend hobby. By the early 80s, Dagohir battles often capture the flag scenarios, were drawing dozens, then hundreds of participants, and the idea spread to other colleges. Dagohir, by the way, still runs today in its annual Ragnarok campout, drawing fighters from across the U.S. each summer. Around that same time, over in the UK, another landmark event took place. In April 1982, the grand halls of Peckforton Castle in Cheshire rang with the footsteps of adventurers and the cries of monsters. A trio of visionaries, Brits, brothers Peter and John Carey, along with Rob Donaldson, had rented out an actual castle to run a game they called Treasure Trap. Imagine Dungeons and Dragons for real. Players showed up in fantasy costumes, were handed foam swords or latex daggers, and sent on missions through the castle's dungeons and grounds. A typical adventure might involve rescuing a princess or finding hidden treasure, with staff members dressed as goblins and ogres lurking around corners. Treasure Trap even introduced a magic system, spells represented by thrown ping pong balls or eggshells filled with glitter for that fireball effect. The rule set borrowed from popular tabletop games. They used the RuneQuest RPG's armor and hit points idea, but adapted for live play. At its peak, Treasure Trap had an astonishing 5,000 members on its books, a testament to how hungry people were for this new form of play. Although the enterprise lasted only until 1984, the castle was sold and the business folded. It sparked a wildfire in the UK. Attendees went home and started their own local LARP clubs. Universities, societies in Durham, Cambridge, and beyond proudly called themselves Treasure Trap in homage. Decades of British LARPing can be traced lineage. Wow, I just wrote that weird. Decades of British LARPing can trace lineage back to the single castle event, which provided that live D&D would work on a large scale. Meanwhile, the Americans were brewing their own versions. In 1981, in Boulder, Colorado, a group of fans influenced by Larry Niven's sci-fi novel Dream Park, which depicts high-tech LARP adventures in a futuristic theme park, formed the International Fantasy Gaming Society, IFGS. They ran their first game that summer, making IFGS possibly the first formal LARP organized in the U.S. IFGS rules were heavily D&D based, classes, hit points, leveling up by gaining treasure and experience. Players in IFGS would create characters much like in a tabletop game, then come to a park for a weekend where a staff of NPCs and game masters had built a story, say an evil wizard's tower to infiltrate. Combat was live and physical with padded weapons, and they used beanbags to simulate spells or arrows. What set IFGS apart was an organizational vision. It was a non-profit society with chapters forming in multiple states by mid-decade. The very name came straight from Dream Park's fictional interpretational fantasy game society, showing how life was imitating art. IFGS showed that LARP could be more than informational fun. It could be an organized hobby with nationwide standards. In parallel, assassin or killer games evolved beyond campuses. Rule booklets for playing assassin with toy guns were published, notably by Steve Jackson in 1981, and groups like MIT's Assassin Guild turned these clandestine stalker games into a lasting subgenre of LARP. By the mid-1980s, the term LARP itself wasn't widespread. People said live role-playing or just described the game they were in, like fantasy adventure. But the phenomenon was spreading internationally. The first recorded LARP in Australia ran in 1983, a science fiction scenario using the traveler RPG setting. In Sweden and Denmark, I wonder if anybody died.
Tim, he was going to play with us, but he showed up dead. Aww.
In Sweden and Denmark, fantasy enthusiasts influenced by D&D began holding weekend-long games in the woods around the early 80s as well. They called it Levande Rollspel, in Swedish, literally living roleplay. It was as if a spontaneous revelation hit fandom worldwide. We can act this out. As one scholarly overview notes, LARP does not have a single point of origin. It was invented independently in multiple places by people who shared a desire to physically experience their beloved fantasy and fiction. However, not everyone was thrilled about these developments. Societal reactions in the 80s ranged from amused to alarm. On the light side, media reports would occasionally show costume teens running in the woods and treated as quirky news. On the darker side, the growing popularity of D&D and related role-playing spurred a morale panic in some communities. In 1979, a university student named James Dallas Egbert went missing in the steam tunnels under his campus. Panicky news stories falsely suggested he was lost due to a live D&D game gone awry, though in reality, the young man had performed a failed suicide attempt and went into hiding afterward. The investigators amplified theories of live event role-playing and saying that this had caused it. The incident helped fuel the 1980s satanic panic, where role-playing games were accused of leading kids to devil worship. In 1982, the TV movie Mazes and Monsters, inspired by the Egbert case, dramatized a college LARP that drives a young Tom Hanks insane, hardly fair or accurate. But that was the fear in the air. So while hobbyists were joyfully slaying foam dragons, and a segment of the public looked down with suspicion, lumping LARPing with the supposed dangers of D&D. Nonetheless, the hobby persisted and grew, slowly shedding its secretive image as more people got involved and realized, hey, it's just fun and fantasy. By 1985, major newspapers and magazines were covering the trend of live-action fantasy societies, often featuring photos of youth in armor defending a make-believe castle. Crucially, the late 80s also saw the founding of one of the most influential LARP systems, Nero. In 1988, Ford Ivey, a game store owner in Massachusetts who had tried other groups' games, decided to create his own fantasy LARP. He wanted it bigger and better, an ongoing campaign world rather than one-off modules. After some trial events with humble results, his first event he later admitted was pretty bad, Ivey and team of friends developed what became New England Role-Playing Organization, or NERO, by 1989. The breakthrough was to have persistent characters and plot lines. If you played a blacksmith or a paladin, that character would return event after event, gaining power and history in the shared world of Tyra. Nero's first big weekend came in August 1989 and drew 150 people, huge for the time. By 1991, their regular events were seeing 300 to 500 players with over 1,300 on the membership rolls. It was explosive growth. Nero franchised chapters beyond New England, effectively spreading a standardized fantasy LARP rule set across the U.S. in the 90s. If you talk to veteran American LARPers, many will recall their first game was Nero or one of its offshoots. It set the template of a boffer LARP, a lightest touch combat with foam weapons.
Boffer sticks.
Yep. Focusing on immersive fantasy adventures over a weekend, run at campgrounds with a mix of combat, puzzles, and NPC-driven story. We're going to look at Nero some more, but we're going to talk about some of the other stuff. So, the 90s.
The juggernaut appears.
Yes. So the 1990s are often remembered as the decade LARP truly went global and diversified. It's the era where a gothic priest or a cyberpunk hacker might join the fantasy warriors on the LARP stage. Let's dive in by first looking at a huge pop culture boost LARP received in the 90s. Vampires. In 1991, a tabletop RPG called Vampire the Masquerade was published, fueling a craze for modern gothic horror. By 1993, its publisher, White Wolf, released Mind's Eye Theater, a book of rules for playing vampire as a live-action game. Suddenly, thousands of fans who loved this brooding world of undead politics and official guidelines to dress up as a vampire and actually act out the drama. And they did, in droves. Mind's Eye Theater LARPs, often just called Vampire LARP, became perhaps the most commercially successful LARP product ever. Clubs and troops sprang up worldwide, from Los Angeles to London to Auckland, meeting in nightclubs, college campuses, even public parks after dark to play out intricate societal intrigues as elegant vampires and werewolves. White Wolf fostered this with an official fan organization, the Camarilla, which by the late 90s boasted several thousand members across dozens of countries. For a while, if you said LARP to someone, they might respond, "Oh, like that vampire thing?" These vampire LARP groups were different from the foam sword fantasy LARPs. Combat was often resolved with rules like comparing stats or playing rock, paper, scissors. And the focus was on improvisational acting and storytelling. Imagine a hotel ballroom full of people in gothic attire whispering conspiracies in character. It was more akin to immersive theater. The mid-90s saw huge convention events, grand masquerades, where hundreds of Mind's Eye Theater players from around the world would gather and play in one massive connected storyline. This infusion of new players and new style expanded the LARP demographic beyond the medieval niche. You could be a LARPer now and never pick up a sword. Perhaps you preferred a velvet cape and fangs instead. Back in the fantasy realm, communities were solidifying. In the UK, the collapse of Treasure Trap had given birth to multiple successor organizations. By the 90s, two big names dominated British fantasy LARP. Labyrinth, a permanent underground cave complex in Kent, running weekly dungeon crawls. Yes, real caves turned into a fantasy game site.
Okay, bucket list just got added.
And the Lorien Trust, which started in 1991, held The Gathering, a yearly festival LARP that drew thousands to a big field for an epic warring nation storyline. The Gathering was essentially a LARP festival, a new model where multiple faction, dwarf clans, dark elf houses, etc., camped in character and battled in alliances, like a Renaissance fair that turned into Braveheart. Continental Europe saw similar moves. In Germany, the first large fantasy LARPs kicked off in the early 90s, and by the end of the decade, German organizers were preparing the ground for mega events that would soon dwarf even the British ones. By the 2000s, Germany's Drachenfest and Conquest would each host 3,000 to 7,000 participants annually, becoming the world's biggest combat fantasy LARPs. And there are videos of this online.
Oh, yeah.
People go all out.
Oh, yeah.
It is amazing. In the US, Nero continued to expand but also fragment. A legal dispute in 1998 split it into separate franchises. Other fantasy campaigns like Alliance, a successor to Nero, and Fantasy Quest popped up. Meanwhile, Amtgard, a Texas-born LARP, spread across the Southwest and beyond, emphasizing a mix of light touches, combat, and fantasy role-playing, gathering thousands of members and even establishing chapters as far away as Germany. Buffer combat games were thriving. On college campuses, the assassin games evolved into a new trend called Humans vs. Zombies in 2005. Though slightly later, it turned campuses into overnight zombie apocalypse simulations with Nerf blasters. By the end of the decade, HVZ had spread to hundreds of schools, introducing a whole generation of students to the idea of real-world roleplay.
Just chef's kiss.
I know. It's awesome.
I've seen some of those videos. They're awesome.
Now, we can't talk about the 90s without addressing some controversies and growing pains. As LARP became more popular, it occasionally intersected with law enforcement and media in uncomfortable ways. One infamous case was in 1996. A group of Kentucky teenagers led by a 16-year-old named Rod Farrell committed a gruesome double murder. The press dubbed them a vampire cult and noted Farrell had been obsessed with the Vampire the Masquerade game. He allegedly fancied himself a 500-year-old vampire and blurred fantasy with reality in dangerous ways. The Vampire Clan murder case was sensationalized on TV and in print, casting a shadow on the vampire LARP community, which suddenly had to clarify that pretending to be monsters doesn't make you one. White Wolf even had to put disclaimers in their books, urging players to distinguish game from life. Fortunately, such extreme incidents were rare, but they became part of LARP lore and cautionary tales. More common were local scares. A group of camouflage assassin game players might be mistaken for real threats, or a call would come into the police about armed people in the park, requiring quick explanation that those AK-47s are just plastic. Bit by bit, authorities got used to LARPers. Many groups proactively worked with police and park officials, establishing rules for where and how the props could be used. There is one story, too, about one of the cons, I can't remember, but somebody put out a call that they were going to do a live-action Vampire the Masquerade event at the hotel, and so many people showed up in black gothic outfits that other patrons of the hotel thought it was a cult trying to take over the hotel.
I mean, it was.
Yes.
Basically, it was, but like, okay, not in a malicious way. Like,
on a more positive note, the 90s also saw the first hints of academic and artistic interest in LARP, particularly in the Nordic countries. LARP started being discussed as a legitimate art form and a tool for social exploration. In 1997, the first Knutepunkt, as Norwegian for meeting point, conference was held in Oslo. Knutepunkt became an annual gathering rotating through Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, where LARP designers and theorists exchanged ideas. This gave rise to the term Nordic LARP, referring not to geography only, but a design tradition that emphasized story, immersion, and serious themes over gaming mechanics. Nordic LARPs in the late 90s began to push boundaries, for example, exploring topics like politics, gender, or ethics through live roleplay. One could find games that had no combat at all, but might simulate a refugee camp or a 19th century ballroom, with a goal of emotional or intellectual experience rather than scoring victory points. This was a stark contrast to, say, a typical dungeon crawl. By decade's end, manifestos are being written. The famous Turku Manifesto in Finland in 1999 argued for total immersion and dropping all out-of-character talk. LARP was, in some circles, becoming self-aware and introspective, pondering its potential as more than play. Let's not leave out another region, Russia and Eastern Europe. After the Soviet Union fell in 1991, there was an explosion of creative hobbies in former USSR countries, and LARP, locally often called Turnier or just role-playing games, caught on like wildfire among youth. By the mid-90s, Russia had huge Tolkien-themed games, hundreds of young people costuming as elves, orcs, and hobbits, staging battles in forests and fields. The absence of commercial toy swords led many to use what they had, wooden or metal weapons, sometimes dulls, sometimes not so dulled. Russian LARP in the 90s developed its own hardcore flavor. On the plus side, extremely dedicated costuming and craft, some built entire fantasy villages in the woods. On the minus side, a reputation for being rough and tumble. It wasn't unusual in those days for Russian LARP battles to leave a few bruises or worse. Stories spread or injuries due to real arrow use or overzealous duels. By the 2000s, safety standards improved. But the 90s Russian LARP scene lives on in legend as a bit intense. Culturally, though, LARP became huge in Eastern Europe. By 1999, conventions specifically for LARP, like Zillinkton in Kazan, were drawing crowds, and national fests in Ukraine, Belarus, and others were common. It showed that the LARP bug was universal. East or West, people wanted to pretend to be knights and wizards once freed to do so. By 1999, live action roleplay was now a worldwide phenomenon. You had robust LARP scenes in North America, the UK, Europe, Western and Eastern, Australia, and scattered groups in South America and Asia. Key companies and organizations fueled this growth. White Wolf with Mind's Eye Theater arguably brought in tens of thousands of new LARPers and is cited as making LARP the most commercially successful it had ever been. The Camarilla Fan Club integrated LARP into an international network of storytelling. Nero and its offspring professionalized weekend fantasy LARPs. As a business, though often run by volunteers, they charged fees and had paid memberships, creating an industry of sorts. Pioneers like Brian Weiss, Ford Ivy, and the Treasure Trap team had by the 90s become almost mythical features among their local communities, though many were still active. Ford Ivy, for example, after selling Nero in the 90s, went on to launch a new LARP project in the 2000s, never losing the itch to create worlds, and the Carries, who created Treasure Trap, expressed pride seeing the UK LARP scene flourish from their experiments. However, amidst the growth, the hobby was still in the shadows of mainstream culture. If you mentioned LARP to a random person in 1999, odds are they had never heard of it, though those who had might reference that Tom Hanks movie or call everyone D&D people. All right, so here we are, 21st century, where the geek shall inherit the earth. Superhero movies rule the box office. D&D is cool again, and yes, LARPing finds its way into TV shows and internet memes. The 2000s and 2010s saw explosive growth and visibility for LARP, so how did it level up? Firstly, fantasy festival LARPs reached peak scale in the 2000s. Remember those German games? They came into their own. Drachenfest and Conquest of Mythodia each grew into annual spectacles with thousands of participants from across Europe. Imagine giant battlefields with alliances of armies of 500 versus 500, full campsites of orcs or undead, complete with war drums and banners, and professional quality special effects, talking flame cannons and pyrotechnics at the final battle. These events drew international players and became something of a pilgrimage for LARP enthusiasts, a chance to experience mass combat on a scale feasible nowhere else. In North America, nothing quite matched those numbers, but Canada's Bicoline came close. Bicoline, a medieval fantasy immersion site in Quebec, founded in 1996. By the 2010s, had built a permanent medieval village of over 200 structures. Every August, it hosts Le Grand Bâti, a week-long event with upwards of 2,000 fighters in the field. Entire taverns and guild houses open up for roleplay and even in-game currency and economy. It's like a pop-up fantasy country. These large events showed the maturing infrastructure of LARP, dedicated venues, full-time staff, and robust commercial support, vendors selling armor, artisans crafting latex weapons, and so on. A small industry blossomed to equip LARPers, from mom-and-pop shops to larger companies shipped gear globally. By the 2010s, one could order a movie-quality elf ear, a foam longsword, and a suit of leather armor online to have it in time for the next game, a far cry from the early days of duct-tape PVC weapons. The 2000s also brought LARP into mainstream consciousness through the magic of the internet. Perhaps the single most viral moment in LARP history came around 2005. The lightning bolt video.
Lightning bolt. Lightning.
If you've seen it, you know, a grainy clip of a wizard costume player tossing packets and shouting lightning bolt, repeatedly at his target. This video originated from an early 2000s game, likely in the USA, and exploded online and became a meme, introducing millions to LARP in a comical way. As Know Your Meme Riley put it, the clip went viral and introduced the obscure hobby of live-action role-playing to the general public. Suddenly, late-night hosts could drop a LARP joke and more people got it. Sure, the representation was a bit goofy. For a while, lightning bolt was a punchline. But as the saying goes, no publicity is bad publicity. Following that, LARP popped up in movies like Role Models, a comedy where the climax features a large mock battle complete with nerdy sorcery. Documentaries such as Darkon and Monster Camp offered sympathetic inside looks at American LARP groups, winning awards and streaming to wider audiences. By the 2010s, TV shows from Supernatural to CSI had LARP-themed episodes. While some were cringeworthy, others were made with clear affection. An episode of the sitcom Community in 2012, for example, lovingly satirized D&D and LARP culture. All this meant that a kid coming of age in 2010 likely knew what LARP was, whereas a kid in 1990 did not. Another huge development in the 2010s, what some call the era of blockbuster LARPs. These are high-production, often one-shot events that aim to deliver a cinematic, immersive experience, usually at a hefty price tag. One of the first to draw international buzz was College of Wizardry in Poland. In 2014, a team of Polish and Danish organizers rented a medieval castle and ran a Harry Potter-inspired event, Wizard School LARP, for several days, complete with house classes, broomsticks flying lessons, and plot lines about magical creatures loose on the campus. Photos of adults in black robes wandering a castle like a real-life Hogwarts went viral in news and media. It was a hit, spawning repeat events and inspiring others. Soon there was a Star Wars-inspired LARP on a battleship in Sweden in 2013, a Downton Abbey-style 1910s manor house LARP in Canada, and more. Companies like Jalbach LARP Studios and later Legendsmith specialized in these design LARPs, often charging hundreds of dollars per ticket. They attracted not just veteran LARPers, but newcomers who viewed it like attending an immersive theater or a themed vacation. Perhaps the apex of this trend was the New World Magischola project in the US, which by 2016 ran multiple wizard school LARPs in an actual university campus, accommodating fans who had never LARPed before, but dearly wished their Hogwarts letter had arrived. The line between LARP and entertainment tourism blurred. Even Disney jumped in 2022 with Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser, a 2-night interactive hotel experience where guests become characters on a space cruise. Essentially a luxury LARP, though Disney carefully avoided the term in marketing. It features actors, storylines, and the expectation that guests cosplay and play along. High profile as it was, it also showed the challenges of such endeavors. The Galactic Star Cruiser was actually closed after 18 months in 2023 due to high costs and niche appeal. Still, its very existence was a milestone. The LARP format had been adopted by the biggest name in theme parks. The Nordic-style games became more ambitious, tackling topics like the AIDS crisis, Just a Little Lovin', Norway, Sweden, 2011, put players in the 1980s New York City gay community during the rise of AIDS.
I mean, what a time.
It gets worse.
Oh, jeez.
The Israel-Palestine conflict. Halat Hisar, Finland in 2013 let players experience life at the West Bank checkpoints, or a living underground dictatorship. Kolekcja, Poland, early 2010, simulated bread lines and oppression. These games often blurred with art installations in theater. In 2010, the book Nordic LARP was published, compiling influential games and essays, and it won a prestigious hobby award, the Diana Jones Award, in 2012. A Norwegian professor of the theater even proclaimed LARP the new theater in his courses. We saw LARP used for education. At this Danish school, LARPing is the future of education, declared a 2015 Vice headline. Students there learned history by role-playing historic scenarios, learned language by immersive simulation. On the flip side, some experiments drew controversy, like a 2014 artistic LARP in the Czech Republic that simulated life in a concentration camp. It intended to educate but stirred ethical debate about the limits of play. Through all this, the Nordic community emphasized a concept called bleed, the bleed-through of real emotions from game to player, and developed workshops and safety techniques to manage intense experiences. These innovations, like brief discussions after emotional games or calibration mechanics for consent during the play, spread across LARP worldwide, making games safer and more inclusive. And speaking of inclusive, the 2010s pushed LARP to be more welcoming and diverse. Early LARP had been stereotypically white male dominated, with notable exceptions, but with wider reach, organizers actively worked to include more women, people of color, and LGBTQ participants. For instance, the UK's Fest LARPs in the 2010s made efforts to address gender imbalance by encouraging non-combat roles and highlighting that everyone is welcome in combat too. The Camarilla, by then rebranded as the Mind's Eye Society and other successor clubs, had many women in leadership and strong LGBTQ presence, given the appeal of Vampire's themes. Online forums and later Facebook groups allowed discussions on how to handle cultural representation, avoiding having players use stereotypes and portraying cultures not their own, and how to adapt rules for those with physical disabilities so they could fully participate. The LARP community gradually became more socially aware, mirroring changes in geek culture at large. One area where the law intersected with LARP in the 2000s was intellectual property. As fan-run LARPs popped up for popular IPs like Game of Thrones or Fallout, the question of rights arose. Generally, most fan LARPs flew under the radar, but some high-profile ones saw official licenses. For example, the Witcher video game series had an officially licensed LARP camp in Poland for a few years. That ended when the license was pulled, not due to any scandal, more a corporate decision. This illustrated the legal status of running a LARP in someone else's fictional universe can be tricky. On the flip side, companies realized LARP could be a marketing tool. There are promotional LARPs for TV shows and movies, often run as one-day tie-in events. A quick note on technology. While LARP is inherently face-to-face and physical, the 21st century did bring gadgets into play. Some games began using NFC tag props or smartphone apps to track character stats. Others integrated augmented reality. In 2019, an official Stranger Things LARP in Los Angeles had players use an app to see AR clues like rifts on the Upside Down, layered on the real environment. There's also been experimentation with online LARP, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic when gathering in person was impossible. Platforms like Zoom were used to run theatrical LARPs or parlor LARPs remotely, keeping communities alive through lockdowns. It wasn't the same as boffer fights in a field, but it opened an interesting new subgenre of digital LARP that some continue to explore. I feel like that's just online role-playing because so many people do it through Discord and stuff now.
Yeah, like I think, yeah, well, I guess we can, when you wrap up, we can talk about the future.
Right. So, we must mention China.
Oh.
In the late 2010s, China developed a massive craze for immersive role-play games called Jubentia. These are essentially murder mystery role-play events, often run in specialized cafes where participants adopt characters and act out a story, usually a mystery to solve. It's not combat LARP, but more akin to interactive theater or the free-form LARPs of conventions. Mm-hmm. Yet it's huge business. By 2021, there were thousands of Jubenja venues across Chinese cities, and it had become a trendy activity for young adults, particularly women. One journalist noted that Jubenja is far more commercially successful and influential than anything we've seen before, even in Nordic countries, predicting it might change global perceptions of what LARP can be. Essentially, China made LARP, in a broad sense, a mainstream social pastime, integrating high production values and storytelling. It's a reminder that LARP's evolution is ongoing and can take very different cultural forms. By the end of the 2010s, LARP was recognized enough that when popular media depicted it, they often did so with a nod of respect. A standout example, the TV show Hawkeye, featured a subplot where Hawkeye begrudgingly participates in a New York City LARP to retrieve a stolen item. The depiction of the LARP, the players, their enthusiasm, and the rules of engagement was spot on and endearing. It left viewers thinking, wow, that actually looks fun, rather than, haha, look at the nerds. That's a sea change in tone from earlier portrayals. So, where are the pioneers and big organizations now, decades later? So, let's start with Brian Weiss, the Dagger Here founder from 1977. Dagger Here celebrated its 45th anniversary in 2022, and while Weiss, aka Eritar, his old character name, long ago handed off leadership, he's something of a folk hero in the community. According to Dagger Here lore, Weiss still attends the annual Ragnarok campout on occasion as an elder statesman, watching new generations charge into battle with the same glee he had as a freshman. The organization he started in college now has chapters across the U.S. and continues to emphasize the fun of battle and friendship over heavy story, staying true to its roots as improvised outdoor battle games. Over in the UK, the legacy of Treasure Map lives on in thriving LARP clubs and companies. Peter Carey and Rob Donaldson likely never imagined that the UK would one day host dozens of LARP events every weekend, from small local adventures to massive fests. Labyrinth, which spun off in 1986, using some of Treasure Trap's DNA, still runs today in those chalk caves of Chislehurst. So, yeah, we can go do that. Making it one of the longest continuously running LARPs in the world. The Careys themselves moved on to other careers, but in interviews, they've expressed astonishment at how far LARP has come. Ford Ivey, Mr. Nero, has had quite the journey. After Nero exploded in popularity, the late 90s split was a stressful time for him. Ultimately, Ivey stepped away from the franchise he created, selling his stake. But by the early 2000s, Ivey was back with a new LARP project called Alliance, essentially trying a fresh start with lessons he learned. He has given interviews reflecting LARP's growth fantasy, saying, live role-playing started in England, but what we do is a fantasy game. Today, Nero as a single entity is no more. It's splintered into Nero International and Alliance LARP and other offshoots which still operate as separate networks. The spirit of Nero's campaign world Tyra lives on in those games. If you attend an Alliance LARP event now, you'll see many mechanics that trace straight back to Ivy's designs in the 80s, a living legacy of game design. Fort Ivy himself, now in his 60s, sometimes makes special appearances at LARP cons, a revered grandfather of the hobby greeted by one-time teenage fans now grown into leaders of their own LARPs. The International Fantasy Game Society, one of the earliest U.S. organizations, continues quietly in pockets, mainly in Denver and Dallas, sticking to its classic D&D in part format. Its influence, however, is felt in the DNA of many American LARPs that followed. When you see a LARP rulebook with classes and hit points, that's IFGS's lineage showing. The concept of chapters under a unified system that IFGS pioneered also became common. What about White Wolf and the Camarilla? The Camarilla fan club had its ups and downs. By the 2000s, White Wolf brought the club in-house, then later it spun off again. After White Wolf was acquired by Paradox Interactive, the official fan LARP network rebranded as the Modern Enigma Society. Vampire LARPs are still running worldwide, though not quite the juggernaut they were in the 90s. White Wolf, now a subsidiary of Paradox, attempted to come back for Vampire IP in the late 2010s with new tabletop editions and hinted at new LARP content. But they stumbled with a PR controversy in 2018, unrelated to LARP mechanics. It was about insensitive content in a source book. This led to a hiatus and reorganization. In the meantime, By Night Studios, a licensee, published updated Mind's Eye Theater books in 2013 through 2016, keeping the torch burning. Many old Camarilla hands are still organizing World of Darkness LARPs, and the community, now often self-organized as troops or through the Modern Enigma Society, remain active. Some of those gothic storytellers from the 90s are now middle-aged, still doing things, joining younger fans intrigued by the personal horror genre. Mark Rain-Hagen, the creator of Vampire the Masquerade, left White Wolf years ago, but in a fun twist, he has dabbled in LARP again by attending events for games like Night in Question, as a VIP guest enjoying the modern evolution of the live horror genre he helped spark. The Nordic LARP leaders of the 2000s have seen their vision spread worldwide. Folks in the Jaco Stenos and Marcos Montola, editors of Nordic LARP book, became respected academics in game studies. Many Nordicans who organized groundbreaking LARPs in the 2000s now run professional conferences or design experiences for museums and businesses. For example, Klaus Rosted, a Danish organizer of blockbuster LARPs, now heads the College of Extraordinary Experiences, a consultancy that applies LARP techniques to corporate training and theme park design. Kind of a weird place for it to go. In terms of geography, some regions have truly embraced LARP as part of culture. Poland has an enormous LARP scene now with both blockbuster and grassroots events. Italy and Spain have growing communities that blend art and fest styles. Brazil and Chile have active LARP groups, often influenced by American and European systems. And as noted, China has essentially reinvented LARP in their own way, with Jubenja parlors becoming a staple of urban nightlife. So where are we now? What's up next? Major LARP companies like Alliance in the US, Profound Decisions in the UK, and Live Adventures in Germany are continuing now, often run by a second or third generation of organizers who grew up LARPing. Many early founders have become mentors or historians, while new blood brings in contemporary ideas. Big genres remain fantasy and horror, but there's a LARP for nearly every niche. Post-apocalyptic scavenging games like Dystopia Rising and science fiction epics like the Czech Republic ran a Fallout LARP, and steampunk adventures, westerns, you name it, you can LARP it.
Star Trek Academy. That's what I want.
Yeah. I mean, it's got to be already out there.
Yeah, probably. I was thinking like that whole time it'd be kind of cool to have three different, like to have like a convention or something. You have like three different like bridge sets.
Yeah.
And like they're all, you know, like people
different
running
ships.
Yeah, and so like people get to like LARP the three different captains and like you're like talking to one and you're cutting off communications to the other. And you're just like trying to resolve the, you know, the.
Then you do the dick move and you're like, beam them over here. So that person's got to run all the way to your.
This is cool. It's a really cool idea. Yeah, it's like I said, I think everybody who has not experienced LARP culture but like likes TTRPGs has always had that thing in the back of their head of like, I don't know if I would or not.
Yeah.
Like part of us is like, look, all the things carry over and this is really interesting. But the other part is like, there's a barrier to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the same barrier I think a lot of people have when it's just, do you want to play D&D?
Yeah. You got to probably get over that the first time.
Yeah.
And just be like, yeah, look, I want to commit to this. I want to really commit to this. And then you got to have your good experiences too, like not being dragged out, like, into the woods with a dude you work with who wants to hit you with swords covered in duct tape.
And the other thing is, make sure this is an official, active thing and not just some dude that's saying, hey, you want to go out in the woods and hit each other?
You've got strong wrists. What?
Yeah, I mean, if you like a Renaissance fair, you'd probably like a LARP.
Yeah, like there's a couple of things. Like there was a outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. There is a park out there that was basically doing something that I was very interested in. In fact, we wanted to go there for a honeymoon. Then we found out that like they had kind of crashed. But like it's one of the things I see is like this idea fascinates me. We've talked at length of what we would do if we had money.
Oh yeah.
And I think one of the problems that keeps happening is that it is kind of cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
Like the people like who organize the stuff that continues to work is probably very volunteer heavy.
Yeah, I think so.
But like the ones that are trying to be high production value and stuff like that, like you're just looking at a model that is very costly, very laborious, and very like...
Yeah, you're basically creating an entire movie set with all of the things that go along with that. Like I said, pyrotechnics and stuff like that all exists. And then you're creating camps and you're building buildings and you basically just made a whole town.
Yeah. The Star Wars, like that hotel one, there's like a 2 or 3 hour Jenny Nicholson video.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. Oh my God. Like it's one of those moments you don't think that as every year progresses, like you're going to turn around and notice that 2 years ago was a moment you missed.
Yeah.
That you'll never like, oh my gosh. That
I had about a year and a half.
Yeah. That was so cool. Look it up, people. If you're at all interested, that video is fascinating. But like, that was like, I mean, it was Star Wars and Disney. It was like the giants doing it. And even then they couldn't hold it for longer than like a year and a half,
And I'm not surprised. I think a lot of people that go to Disney World are there for what's happening around them and not necessarily to be in it.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have a bunch of parents whose kids are probably really excited to be there, but they're like, I don't want to do this. Yeah, it's just like, I just want to go to bed. We'll get up and go into the park, whatever. But like, here's this whole event, and it's going on it had to have been running 24/7.
Yeah. Like it was running kind of continuously. I mean, the staff has to go to bed at some point, but like,
well, I'm sure they just had people that rotated out.
Yeah. In another life. Yeah. Hey, you know what can we say? This is LARPing.
Lightning bolt.
Lightning bolt. Lightning bolt. If you've got stories, if any of you have like experience, gone out there and done these things, please, dear God, tell us.
Oh yeah.
We would love to hear about your adventures out in the dark. I know there was a person we worked with who told us that there's because like they have Star Trek LARPs at conventions. That's a very popular thing where like they'll have some big comic convention or something, and like in one of the restaurants or the bars, they'll have like an open like Star Trek LARP where people pretend they're like on one of the ships. And they said there was this whole LARP that was organized, and it had like all these different missions and stuff, and it was like there were members of the cast that like were at the convention, and they were kind of like popping in and out. And the dude who played Q was sitting in the bar for like 4 or 5 hours, and the organizers gave him like a big clue, and no one talked to him because everybody was scared. Everybody's like, dude, I can't go talk to him. He's like,
talk to Q?
And he was like, what? Why won't people talk to me? And then at the end, he was just like, anybody, I could have told you anything. Like, I'm cute. Like, I was like, that's awesome. That's so cool. Yep. To be in the right place at the right time.
Mm.
All right, folks, we're going to wrap this up. And hey, go be weird.